Today we're talking with Stephen Gapps. As many of you know, he's a Sydney-based historian with interests in public history and early colonial Sydney. In 2011, Stephen won the New South Wales Premier History Award for Cabral to Fairfield City, a history of multicultural community. And then in 2017, he also won the State Library of New South Wales Merriweather Fellowship. So those of you who already know Stephen will know that he likes to wear a few hats, not only metaphorically in terms of the work that he does, but also actually today he's wearing a very fine baseball cap with a maritime insignia on it, which is appropriate because he is also a curator at the Maritime Museum, and he is currently also the president of the History Council of New South Wales, which is where I first met Stephen because I'm on the executive with him. But today we're talking to Stephen with a different cap on altogether, and this is his cap as author. He's actually written 4 books, but we're going to talk to him today about a book that came out with New South in 2018, which is called The Sydney Wars. It's such an exciting and interesting book. I think it makes some very significant contributions in different ways that will be of great interest to you, our dear listeners, because it combines a sort of sub-discipline that a lot of historians haven't given a lot of attention to, and I think Stephen makes a compelling case for the fact that we do need to give more attention to military history and historical reenactments, which is part of his background. And what I love about the book is also the fact that it's rich with archival detail and analysis. It does make some important historiographical insights into what is a very contested and important area. But most of all, it's elegantly written and damn easy to read. It's like a warm knife through a butter. So congratulations, Stephen, on a great book.
Thank you.
And thanks for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Could you start by giving us a little bit of an overview, please, about the time, the place and the focus of your book, and then tell us why you wanted to write this, what excited you?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, essentially the title is The Sydney Wars, conflict in the early colony, so 1788 to 1817. That's the time period I chose because it's a period that hasn't been united, I guess, by historians. There's a lot of different descriptions of the warfare that occurred across the Sydney region in terms of Pemway's War, the Hawkesbury Wars, the Mays Wars, discrete conflicts. But I suppose what I've done is think about this more strategically as a campaign of resistance and occupation across what is an obvious geographical area, the Cumberland Plain, surrounded by the fringes of the mountains around Sydney. So it was something that struck me a few years ago that these, in one sense, these small wars, as the British called the conflicts at the time, small wars, the little conflicts at the edge of empire, not these big historical battles. These small wars, not outside Australia as well, in other parts of the empire, were never really studied by military historians. They were minor skirmishes, minor campaigns, and I think that is a disservice definitely to the Australian frontier wars, because in one sense, if you think about the scale of conflict, and we're talking a high percentage of people involved in that conflict. When you think about the numbers of people in the early colony at that time, in 1788, you've got just over 1,000 Europeans, and we don't know exactly, several thousand Sydney people. Which changes radically in 1789 with the smallpox plague. So the Sydney population is decimated. Now, and the European population only grows very, very slowly. We've still only got several thousands a few years later. Now, if you think of the casualties and the scale of conflict inside that, not inside the empire, but inside Sydney, the colony of New South Wales, you start to realise that, that conflict was quite serious. It was quite a threat to the occupation of Sydney, and quite an amazing response. So that's kind of where the book, why it's called the Sydney Wars. It's bringing those, what we've historically seen as minor conflicts together, and which creates a different picture, I think, a different picture of resistance.
Absolutely. I found that visceral in your book, and I think it was probably the thing that struck me the most. I've done a little bit of research into Ireland at a comparable period, and when you read those sources, you really have a sense of an environment that is on the knife edge, and fear permeates the way that people are living their lives in what is a very contested zone. And I think you've created a similar sort of sense. And putting that filter or lens back into the way that we see that helps us to understand the way that people are relating to one another, the decisions that they're making, but also it kind of gives us a new way of thinking about where we are now today.
Yeah, I guess a couple of things out of that is, one is that I think we've tended to see a lack of resistance and cultural cooperation and engagement between Sydney people and the colonisers without the deep threat that firearms and military control from the colonisers was operating. And it's a very subtle operation. It really involves scouring the archives, because when you don't have periods of conflict, you don't look for military kinds of history. But when you start to see there were stockades here, there were small detachments placed here, there were communications networks, there were defensive buildings built around in the colony itself and around the outskirts of Sydney that were often multi-use buildings. They were for guarding convicts, but they were also potentially defensive buildings against not just external foreign French threats, for example, but for uprisings by convicts, but also for any resistance, which was regular and often. The first period in the mid-1790s, then again around 1800, 1804 to 5, and then 1814 to 16, massive conflict around the outskirts and right into the incredibly near the centre of the colony in Sydney. So when you pull that together, I think, as you said, you get a really different picture of a visceral situation of fear. And the other thing is that unites, I think, the whole period is the same language as used by governors, from Governor Phillip to Governor Macquarie, about striking terror into the population of Sydney. You see, and it's based upon, as you said, there's so many similarities with the repression of the Irish and in the ways that this military occupation unfolds in Sydney in particular, and I think elsewhere afterwards as well. These lessons were well learnt in Ireland in particular. The Marines in particular and New South Wales Corps learnt their lessons in North America, but the governor's methods of control, Phillip sets out on 4 punitive expeditions. Personally leads 4 punitive expeditions, and one of them, one he orders Tench to bring back the heads of 10 Aboriginal people in sacks. That's the humane Governor Phillip. And Macquarie uses the same language and hangs 2 Aboriginal men, their bodies in trees and and their heads are taken back to England as displays, which again is based upon what happened in Ireland, displays of the retribution of British dominance.
So I'm picking up things like this high sense of public display that exists in so many of these moments. And I wonder if there's something that you want to say there about how perhaps reenactment has helped you think about the theatres of war and public displays, which we know, the spectacle, but perhaps also why you've made the case for using the term Sydney Wars as opposed to the better known phrase Frontier Wars.
Look, that's a good question. Thinking of a description that unites, it doesn't necessarily. I call it the Sydney Wars because I bring those conflicts together. They are part of the first Frontier Wars. If I retitled the book one day, or there's another edition, it might be something like Australia. The Sydney Wars, Australia's first frontier war, or something similar. But I think it obviously connects into the Frontier Wars. I'm also a little I've been a little bit reluctant to think to tie into. I mean, I still use the term frontier wars. I think it's obviously used, but I do have some issues with that term. I think it's something that historians developed to very well describe those conflicts that play out as the frontier expands. But for several reasons, I find it problematic in that what I found in the Sydney Wars in particular and elsewhere is that it doesn't quite encapsulate. There's warfare inside the frontier. There's warfare at Lane Cove, in 1804, which is well inside what you might call the frontier. And there's a lot of instances I've been finding elsewhere around New South Wales where, and this is the case with all guerrilla warfare campaigns, it occurs, and it has to occur inside the frontier, in the colony itself. I also find the idea of the frontier is looking towards, from the centre to the periphery, to the edge of conflict, not from the heartland looking towards the empire.
So it's an innately European perspective.
Yeah,
beautiful.
I mean, it's got a currency now, and that's fine. But I think it would be an interesting question if what if Aboriginal people were to decide what the name for this conflict was, and it might be a very different name.
Well, that was another question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, I love the way that you deftly used language. You made language choices throughout the book, and the other was this choice to use the word Sydney people. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's two main reasons. I think it gives, firstly, three. I think it gives ownership to those people, to the Sydney region. It gives a sense of they are the Sydney people. The Europeans are from outside Sydney. It gives. I think it does give an agency to people in the Sydney region. I think also it goes. I intentionally use that word because it unites the different nations, First Nations, in that campaign as one. And there's a lot of times where you cannot say it was Eora, it was Darug, it was Darebin people here, there and everywhere, because unlike what we might be told at school, in school history, Aboriginal people did unite,
right,
and were forced, not just chose to unite, but were forced to unite, particularly after smallpox had decimated populations. We know that all different First Nations around Sydney were working together. We know that even in 1814, Darawal and Gunnegarra were uniting against, in a combined force against the colonists, right? So I think it was in some ways also shorthand to say that these are at this point, against this threat, these are a united series of First Nations, which is not what we learn. You're
listening to Glam City on 2SER 107.3. To download this show, head to 2ser.com or your favourite podcast app and look for Glam City. This show is made by the Australian Centre for Public History at UTS with the support of 2SER. And on this episode, we're talking to Sydney-based historian Stephen Gapps. So let's go into what I think is some of the most exciting arguments that you're making in this book. And then I thought perhaps you could give us one or two examples of how you make this case. And that is that the Sydney people were not only strategic in their resistance, that they were highly adaptive. And as you've just said, they also were effective in forging alliances to do so, to mount a campaign of guerrilla war resistance against European expansion.
Mm-hmm. I think, unfortunately, it's been the military historians who have looked at frontier wars have kind of come to an agreement that the guerrilla campaigns, warfare campaigns in different frontier wars could never be successful. Because they say Aboriginal people could not unite their disparate forces, and they could not fight on. They had terrain advantage, but could not fight on an equal footing against muskets. Now, I dismiss several of these claims. Did not use muskets for a start is incorrect. There's several instances there's way more instances of warriors capturing muskets, not so many of them being used. I'm not sure what the story is there, whether they were intentionally being taken out of the firearms pool or were potentially to be used and never were able to be used.
But it is a strategy that's
definitely
being used.
Either way,
that's
it's
right.
a strategy.
Yeah.
And firearms being used. I mean, there's the what's effectively a massacre of Europeans out at Mulgoa, where warriors hold up, ambush these convicts who are chasing them with firearms, and basically tell them to drop their weapons, pick up their firearms and shoot them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And showing and that's another point, is a skill and knowledge of firearms from day one.
From early on.
Day one. And you still read histories where people say, oh, but, they didn't know how to use firearms even in 1816. Oh, I mean, come on. There's reports of them speaking perfect English as well as using firearms by 1816.
Yeah. I love the description that you draw from one of what Contentious observations, which is of, I think it's a Gadigal person quite early on coming up and inspecting musket and looking at the bayonet edge and giving a very distinctive as if to say, okay, we need to take this seriously.
Yeah. And there's a constant in all the diarists in the early period, 1788 to early 1790s, a constant fear by the colonists that the Aboriginal people would understand the musket, and there was specific orders to try and not show them how the musket works, because they were concerned that if they did that, they would gain an advantage. And there was also a constant series of orders issued to capture escaped convicts who often had firearms with them, because the worst fear, particularly for Governor King, Governor Hunter in that period, was that escaped convicts with firearms would unite with warriors.
Which happened on a number of occasions.
Yep.
And so strategic, adaptive and forging alliances amongst each other, but also with convict groups as well. But as you say about the smallpox episode that happened within 18 months of European settlement in Sydney to the Gadigal people, that by reminding us about how much that decimated the population, you put contingency back into that moment and raise the question of what could have happened.
Yeah. I mean, ordinarily in Napoleonic Wars history or American Civil War, or the First World War, we always include battle casualties and deaths by disease, related to warfare. Why don't we include the smallpox epidemic in terms of the Sydney Wars? Then we'd have to be thinking of thousands of people as casualties in that warfare. I'm not saying it was a military strategy to infect the population around Sydney with smallpox, but it's a byproduct of the military occupation of Sydney. And it's interesting if you do factor that in, the decimation of that warfare, which is similar where smallpox occurs in other areas outside Sydney, but it was particularly, decimating in Sydney.